Hello and welcome to the second lecture in the fourth week. And today I'm going to talk about public opinion. And so last class we talked about voting, which is one way of getting at public opinion. So remember we defined public opinion before as preferences, right? So what we're talking about when we talk about preferences is really just we're talking about what people think about various policies. And one way of getting at that is by allowing people to vote on various things. And as we saw in last class, this has various problems, and in this class what we're going to do is look at public opinion itself and see whether it has problems of its own. So just to refresh your memory about what was wrong with voting, so there's first no ideal method of voting, as we saw. So if we make certain assumptions of what we might want in a democratic method of voting, no voting method fits all of those. And in fact, depending upon what voting method you pick, you can come up with very different results. So as I said in last class, if you are able to pick the alternatives that are going to be voted upon, so if you, as I say, set the agenda and are also able to pick the voting method, then you can largely determine the voting results based upon those two things and not on the opinion of people in the public, right? So that's sort of startling. But so there's more problems with voting besides these more formal problems, because those are due to the sort of logical structure of how we bring together different preferences, into a social preference. But there's different issues. So first, you can think of voting as a bunch of people coming together, casting their ballots, but it seems like what we're really concerned with is getting at the public itself. So everyone in the public, we want to know what they think. Voting is one way of doing that, right? So we're able to get people's opinions in a rather easy way by having them come forward and cast their ballot. But of course, this has its own problems because you're sort of allowing people to self-select themselves. So there's going to be certain sorts of people who are more likely to vote, to have the time to come out to vote, to have the inclination to come out to vote. Predominantly these are older people, especially retired people who don't have a lot of other things to do, and younger people are notoriously not prone to vote. Right, so you might have various views of why this is, but usually people, over 40 are those who are most likely to vote, and so you're undercounting. If you really care about the preferences of everyone, what you're doing is undercounting the views of the younger and overcounting the views of the older. And this might worry you, and also the poor are far less likely to vote. And that seems rational, right? Because oftentimes voting takes a lot of time, and if you're working 2 jobs or something, or you have a lot on your plate, maybe you have children or something like that, it's going to make a lot less sense to vote than if you're retired, or if you have generous flex time or something at your work where you can go and vote, or you're a student or something. So these problems arise when we're thinking of the sample that we're getting when we look at who votes, and so this might be a worry if we're actually trying to get the underlying preferences. So this is also a problem with town hall meetings, which Jane Jacobs talks about. So these sort of meetings of various committees in a city. People come, they say what they think about various issues. These are notoriously self-selecting. So you'll have a very small group of people who go to many town hall meetings or go to many city meetings, and many people who never go to any of them, and so their voices aren't heard at all. And this is even a worse representation than voting, because it takes a lot longer to go to these meetings. So you have to, oftentimes, sometimes they're during the day, right? Other times they're right after normal work time, and they take a number of hours out of your day. And so if you really don't have the time to go to these meetings or have other things that you really want to do, you're unlikely to go. And so what ends up happening is you get a small group of people. Again, often retired people or something like that. So with these sort of mechanisms, these sorts of people have a lot more power than they might otherwise if we were sort of polling the public or something in some sort of statistical way. So also, there are strategic elements of voting in elections which you might not want included into our method of aggregating our preferences, right? So if really all we care is about what people think in the public, it shouldn't matter whether some people are better at campaigning in elections than others. So you might worry that these sorts of things get in the way. So I'm not just talking about money, but that does matter. But just the knowledge to know the knowledge of how you win elections. There's people who make lots of money because they're very good at winning elections. And if that's the system we're using to pick out those policies that people want, that seems possibly troubling because your skill at winning an election doesn't seem to have anything to do with whether you are purporting the sort of things that people want. But okay, so those are problems with voting, and it has led a lot of people to think that maybe for these day-to-day policy issues, they shouldn't be put up for a vote. So in some states, like especially California, very often times they have ballot measures. So they have individual policies which are brought to ballot, and many people see this as a bad thing because you have all of these sort of things affecting the vote, right? So you have this policy, and you have all self-selection bias, you have the problem with no ideal voting method, you have strategy involved. And this seems to affect the vote, not in a way that reflects what people actually think in the public. And so that's worrisome if what you really want is what people think, right? And so then it doesn't seem like these ballot measures are really that democratic in a way, right? They're not getting at what people actually want. They're getting at something that arises out of these other effects. But there's a bigger concern. So it's not just that voting is problematic, because you might think we could poll people or something. Like there's various scientific methods of getting at public opinion that you might think we could use, and in fact some people think this is what politicians should be doing. They should be constantly keeping in contact with their constituency and trying to understand what they want. So this there's some promise there that there might be other methods to get around this voting issue. However, there's good reason to think that it's not just the voting method that is problematic. So there has been a lot of research since basically public polling began, and especially since the 60s, into whether people have stable and distinct preferences for various policies. So whether they have a public opinion about some policy over another. And so one of the first sort of significant studies in this area was by Philip Converse, who did a number of very, very huge studies of public opinion that involved the late 50s. So that he was collecting polling information from the late 50s, and then he published a book and then this in a paper as well about this data in the 60s. And so one of the significant results he got from this was a longitudinal analysis of people's opinions over time. So what he was able to do with this data, what was so great about this, was he actually had the same group of people at 3 different times. And so you could see how their opinion changed over time. So what was rather startling about this is that he saw that most people's opinions about policies varied randomly over time. So he used a rather complex statistical method to find this, but what he found was basically at most 20% of people have stable preferences, the rest do not. And what this means is it's not just a steady change. So he's not talking about a change over time. But what we can see is that, so imagine there's like three, at the three different times, the earliest, the middle, and later. If there was a steady change over time, you would expect the first time to be more related to the middle time, and that one to be more related to the last time, and the last time is related to the first time, right? Because there's a change over time. But what he found was that there was no, like, it didn't matter which order you had them in, right? So there was no point in time was more related to any point in time, any other point in time, than the other points in time, if that makes sense. So what this means is there's just this random variation. So you start out with a certain policy that you espouse, and then you have another one at the second time, and then you have yet another one at the third time. And there's no pattern to this, seemingly, for most of the people. And so this made a lot of people think that, wow, there's really no point to wondering what people think, because they just don't think anything, right? So they don't. There's like when you have two policies, and the sort of policies were like, they were slightly abstract, right? So these were policies like trade policy. So what do you think about? And this was the 50s, so there was various trade issues or tariffs or whatever. So what do you think about tariffs? And this would vary randomly. So this is a rather important policy decision, especially at the time. But people just had no opinion over such a substantial issue. So this led to a number of, a lot of research over, between that time. A more modern view of this comes from Zahler, and he wrote a very significant book in 1992. And in here, so he's sort of advancing the same sort of view that Converse has, but he elaborates on it. What he thinks is, of course, there's sort of underlying cognitive structures that determine preferences, right? So, of course, you're going to like some things more than other things, and why do you say that you would rather have a tariff than no tariff or something like that, or rather, free trade versus restricted trade? Well, there's something in your mind, your brain, that determines that. But what you say at any given time is determined by the salient features of the situation. So what he thinks is that various features of like how the person asked you, what you had for breakfast that day, what you saw on the way to, when you're being polled, what you saw on the way to the interview or whatever, these things can largely determine what you say. And what he says is that a lot of these opinions are really just constructed off the top of your head, right? This is the top of the head model. And so what you do is, there's your brain there, but it's not like there's policy preferences in your brain, right? Or even in your, your mind or something. There's nothing really there. But all you're doing is you're just making something up. So you're sort of making an opinion up as you're asked. And then, what's going to determine what you would actually say? Well, things around you, things you see. And so this makes it such that opinions can be radically changed based upon trivial features of your environment, trivial features of what you've been thinking about that day. So it doesn't seem like polling or voting in this case would really give you an idea of what people prefer, because how people vote today might just be what they heard on the news yesterday. This also might explain why TV ads and such for various political issues might be very useful, right? These might have large effects on people if this is true. Like, if people are actually constructing their opinions just out of thin air as they go, as they encounter situations that they need to give them, and if these are largely determined by features just around them or what they're hearing, this is very troubling if you're trying to construct policies out of what people in society prefer, if you're trying to be democratic in this way. So that's concerning. Then there's a third, and so this is related to the previous two. So Zoller has advanced an elite-driven view of politics, but others have as well. And the idea here, so there's two views of politics. Well, there's more than two, but there's two basic ones. One is that the views that political parties have and political candidates have are determined by the views of people, right? So the views of people, they select the politicians, and because of this, I mean, they have this power to select, so politicians mold their views after what the people have. This is one major view. The other is the elite-driven view, and that's the top-down view. So the other one was bottom-up, right? People select, or they have opinions, and those go up, percolate up to the elite, the political elite, like politicians and party leaders and stuff. And the other is top-down, where party leaders have certain views, and this causes people to change what they think. And what makes this second one, so the first thing that makes this plausible, is that one of the few things that is actually extremely stable, even going back to the Converse study, and then Zoller had his own study, and there's been many subsequent studies about these sort of things. Party ID is one of the few very stable preferences. So party ID in moral issues, so what people think about abortion or what people think about gay marriage or something, like those things are rather stable in this way we're describing. So they might change over time, but they're not random. They don't randomly change. And so party ID is the most stable thing over time. So whether someone thinks that they're Republican or Democrat, or, and what they think of people who are Republicans and Democrats, that's very stable. So, what someone thinks of George W. Bush is going to be a very stable thing. And same thing with what someone thinks of, like, Obama or Hillary Clinton or something. So these are very stable. And unfortunately, especially with the moral issues, especially so this doesn't really help us, right? I mean, so even if people have stable moral views, this doesn't help us form policies, especially in cities, when the policies that are relevant aren't really morally charged. Whether we build a highway, add some lanes or something, this, to a highway, or we build a subway, this is, our moral views don't really help us with this very much. Okay, so there's a lot of examples of people in the electorate switching views based upon what the party says. Predominant among this is what people's opinions of war are, because it's funny how when one party is in power, usually the presidency, right? They're the ones dictating what's going on in war. The other party is almost always against that war, which is, so that, and this goes back and forth. And one really sort of funny example, I think, and really interesting example comes from the 1940 presidential election, which was between FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Wendell Willkie. So Wendell Willkie was the Republican candidate, FDR was the Democrat. And before this time, before possibly the September and the October before the November election, before this, Republicans were against us getting involved in World War II, right? So the Germans had started the war in 1939, and the Americans were sitting on the sidelines. They're sending things to England. This is one of the big policy issues, like, should we send guns and supplies to England? Republicans were against this, and Democrats were generally for it. FDR was supporting this, and so that's sort of what the political landscape was like. Willkie, however, in late September, just before the election, decided that he was also for helping England in the war. So he was for sending ships, or not ships, but sending supplies on ships even with the threat of Germans, possibly sinking them. And he did, they weren't thinking of entering the war yet with actual soldiers, but he was supporting sending supplies and such. And so the public opinion of these polls, there's a couple polls from this 2-month period. You show this dramatic change from Republicans being against any intervention in the war to Republicans going along with Democrats and saying, yes, we should intervene, we should help out the British. And then what's interesting is Willkie lost, right? So he lost the election. And right after this, so in December of 1940 until December of 1941, when U.S. was attacked by the Japanese, Republicans went right back to being against any support of the war. So the shift was dramatic, and it seems it was simply because Willkie supported it, and there weren't any reasons for him to support it. He just thought it would help him in the election. And you might really worry that this makes it seem like, wow, that the elites really are just driving things. And this is consistent with what Malich said about how like landowning elites and the property-based interests really drove politics. This is kind of going along with that. So we can bring this back to a city example. So we might imagine that people in some city want to build additional lanes on a highway just outside their city. So there's really good reasons to do this, you might think. So traffic might be very congested, so we could reduce traffic congestion, and thus we can move around faster. That's great. And also, you might think improved traffic flow might improve your city's economy. So high traffic is a drain on the economic viability of a city, and so you might think that adding more lanes to this highway, spending this money and adding these lanes, might really help out your city, and this could be great. So what's important about this example, so what I'm trying to do here is show you that like how this plays out in cities. What people actually prefer are these things I've listed, right? So these are the things actually people prefer. They don't care about the lane itself, right? So the additional traffic lanes are merely instrumental, right? So they're merely getting at these other things that they really want. And you might think these are also instrumental, right? So you might think that there's some sort of idea of the good life that they're actually aiming at. But the traffic lanes are certainly not what they want. If the traffic lanes gave them other things, they wouldn't want them, right? So what they really want is a better economy and getting around faster. And it seems like we can trust them to know that they want that, right? So these are not policy preferences. So wanting to be able to move around faster or wanting a better economy for a city, these are not different policies that we usually pick from, right? We need to figure out what policies get us these things. That's exactly what public policy does. And so just having preferences for these things doesn't seem like enough. So what might happen here is they might rely upon experts that tell them that they could get those things, right, from extra lanes. And in fact, if there's some good reason to think that those things would not be, you could not obtain those things from extra lanes, right? So there's such thing as induced demand for the properties further from the city. So when you build more highway capacity, what ends up happening is people make the rational decision, wow, I can live further away from my work and get there in the same amount of time. That's great. And so what ends up happening, the theory goes, is that more people move out to further away places, and what basically ends up happening is there's more traffic now, and traffic fills the extra lanes, and within a number of years the congestion is just as bad. So this is this has happened in many places actually. So this might happen. So based upon the situation, and how are the people supposed to know whether this is that sort of situation, or this is a situation where they can actually get faster movement around the city? That's hard to know. That's something an expert has to tell them. They have to sort of analyze the dynamics of the city and tell them what is likely to happen. Additionally, more highways on the outside of town might actually hurt the city, right? So this might ease travel around the suburbs to the city and to the suburbs, right? So less people might live in the city now. So you might think that, unintuitively sort of, but this is what many things are like. They're not intuitive what actually is going to happen. Things might get worse even though they thought they might get better. And so here we see that because people have preferences for things that are not themselves policies, and when they do maybe have preferences for policies, they might not be very informed. And what they really care about is these issues of, in this case, congestion and, ease of travel and their economy. Experts really are very important. So they serve this very important function. It doesn't seem like we can just get rid of them, and sort of enjoy this more democratic situation, but not of experts. That seems like something we can't do. So finally, we might wonder whose preferences matter. So if we're voting on things, or if we're collecting polling data on things, on people, who should we listen to? And what I really mean by this is, the biggest problem is whether we should listen to only current residents, right? So we can't go and find future residents. They don't exist yet, or they're not here. We don't know who they are. We can sort of infer what they might want, and this is often difficult when we're only listening to preferences of people here now. We often lose sight of the fact that there'll be future people. So, for instance, in your readings this week, you read about the resistance to the DC Metro in places like Cleveland Park and then Mid-City DC, and also College Park. And the pushback from the construction of the Metro is actually one of the reasons that the College Park Metro is 15 minutes away from the university, right? So there were a few different planned routes, and many of the residents didn't want the other routes, and so it ended up along sort of the cheapest route, and the least problematic one was the one they chose. And so because of that, because the people who were there at the time really were the ones whose voices were heard, people now, you might think, are, have to pay the price because they don't have this great metro access. And in fact, in the Red Line in Cleveland Park and the Green Line in Mid-City, those people were, you might say, ignored in many cases, because the city knew that this was an important project, and they were ignored for the better, right? You might think. So, so that's problematic. So how do we include, future people's preferences? That's really unclear. What's also important is to include interests of entire groups. So one way you might do this, so here, this could be a solution to who should we listen to. We could say, well, we do care about groups. So the fact that so some class of people, right? So maybe middle class or lower class people are benefit from this project as well as rich people. That's important, right? So the fact that the Green Line went through Mid-City DC, this actually really benefited the people who live there now, right? Regardless of class. There's some way that they might get pushed out, but there's still lots of areas that are not, incredibly expensive in that route. And so, you can include classes, like economic classes, as well as racial groups, and so these might be the groups you're concerned with. And so, we can look to Rawls for this, because Rawls talks also about groups. The well-being of entire groups is important for him. This is one way of analyzing what's good for people. And you might think that being able to stay, in your old neighborhood, being able to stay where your family is, might be a primary social good. So not being driven out of a part of town just because it's changing and new residents are flooding in might be something that we should be concerned about. And so it seems like we might be able to ignore the preferences of people now who don't want the construction, don't want, worried about various things, and keep in our mind the group at large and these people's children, right? That's also important. So so this is something to keep in mind when we're thinking about analyzing preferences. Okay, so next time I'm going to talk about how we should integrate expert opinion and experts into a democratic policy formation process. So as we're seeing, this seems like a very important thing to do, and it's not clear how to do this. And so this is going to be rather important. And what is the balance? And as I do that, I'm going to show some of the sort of idealistic city planning that we kind of touched on in the first week, but didn't go too deep into. So I want to cover the people the planners and the theorists who were actually really important for sort of dreaming up the city settings that we see around us. So the modernist movement was very influential in designing high-rises and designing sort of automobile-based cities and such, as was the garden city and garden movement. So we'll look at those, and then you'll kind of see how where a lot of the city planning came from, and then we'll talk about the balance between designing a city as a whole, right? So it's important to have coherence in a city, otherwise things don't work, but allowing for some organic elements, because when you, as Jacobs was saying, right, when you design something entirely, right, so you destroy everything, then you build it back up again, you risk destroying the neighborhood, or you risk destroying the actual place that was there, and what you build might be dead in a way, and it might lack all the important features that you had. Okay, so that'll be next time, and I'll see you later.